Something just broke in American politics. Not a rumor, not a leak, not an allegation whispered on cable news. This time, it came from a federal court. Sealed documents locked away for nearly a decade have been forced into the light. And inside them is a story Donald Trump has spent years denying. Not with opinions, not with spin, but with records, dates, depositions, flight logs, phone calls. I want you to pause for a moment, because this is not about gossip. It's not even about scandal. It's about what happens when power collides with truth and truth refuses to stay buried. Trump has always said he barely knew Jeffrey Epstein, that their relationship was distant, casual, insignificant. But courts don't deal in vibes. They deal in evidence. And now that evidence is public. This moment matters far beyond one man. It tests whether facts still matter in a polarized democracy, whether transparency can still pierce power, and whether voters are willing to look, really look, when the record contradicts the story they've been told. If you care about accountability, stay with me. Because to understand why this is exploding now, we have to step back and see how we got here. To do that, we first need to be clear about the problem everyone is suddenly trying to redefine. Let's be precise about what this moment actually is and what it is not. This is not a criminal verdict. This is not a court declaring guilt, and it is not a sudden discovery pulled out of thin air. What we are witnessing is something more structural and more dangerous for a political figure, a direct collision between a long-standing public narrative and a documentary record that tells a very different story. For years, Donald Trump has framed his connection to Jeffrey Epstein as minimal, peripheral, almost accidental. That claim became part of his political armor. Repeat it often enough, attack anyone who questions it, and eventually many people stop asking. But the problem with systems of law, unlike systems of propaganda, is that they accumulate records quietly, patiently. And when those records are unsealed, they don't argue, they don't persuade. They simply exist. The core issue here is credibility. When a leader asks the public to trust his word, and the paper trail contradicts that word, the damage goes far beyond one relationship. It erodes confidence in judgment, honesty, and accountability. And to understand why these documents carry such weight, we have to return to the long shadow cast by the Epstein case itself. To grasp the gravity of what's being revealed now, you have to understand the nature of the Epstein case itself. This was never just a criminal scandal. It was a systemic failure of wealth, influence, and silence, reinforcing one another over decades. Jeffrey Epstein did not operate in isolation. He operated inside elite social ecosystems: Palm Beach, Manhattan, private jets, exclusive clubs, spaces where money bends norms and power discourages questions. For years, warning signs surfaced and then vanished. Investigations stalled, deals were cut, files were sealed. After Epstein's arrest in 2019 and his death in federal custody, the public sensed that the story was incomplete. Too many names, too many unanswered questions, too much secrecy surrounding who knew what and when. That is why these documents matter. They are not reactions to today's politics. They were created years earlier, under oath, long before a presidential campaign or an election cycle could shape incentives. They sit at the intersection of memory and record, of what people said publicly and what was quietly documented behind closed doors. And when a system built on secrecy finally cracks, it never does so gently. It breaks at a specific moment, what I call the first real crisis point. The first real rupture came not from the media, but from the judiciary. A federal judge looked at arguments to keep these records sealed and said, no. That decision is the turning point. Because when courts override privacy claims from a former president, they're making a very specific statement. The public interest now outweighs personal damage. That is rare, and it is never accidental. Trump's legal team fought hard to stop the release. Emergency motions, warnings of irreparable harm, claims that disclosure would prejudice ongoing cases, all of it rejected. The judge's reasoning was simple and devastating. You cannot publicly shape a narrative for years, then demand secrecy when documents challenge it. Once the seal was lifted, the story stopped being theoretical. It became concrete. Logs, dates, patterns, independent witnesses, multiple sources telling overlapping stories without coordination. This is the moment where denial strategies usually collapse. Not immediately, but structurally. Because the issue is no longer whether the story is fair. It's whether the record exists. And once you accept that the record exists, the next question becomes unavoidable. How did this system allow such contradictions to persist for so long? This is where we have to talk about the mechanism beneath the headlines. Because scandals don't survive on denial alone. They survive on structure. Powerful figures operate inside overlapping systems, media attention cycles, legal delay, partisan loyalty, and public fatigue. If you can slow the process long enough, confuse it just enough, and attack critics aggressively enough, accountability begins to dissolve. Not because facts disappear, but because attention does. Trump has mastered this environment. Deny first, minimize second, attack third, and if necessary, flood the zone with so much noise that the original question gets buried. It's not an emotional strategy. It's a systemic one. Sealed documents play directly into that system. As long as records remain hidden, public narratives dominate. Repetition becomes truth. Memory replaces evidence. And over time, the gap between what happened and what people believe widens. What makes these newly released materials so destabilizing is that they interrupt this cycle. They reintroduce friction into a system designed to avoid it. Paper trails don't respond to insults. Sworn testimony doesn't retreat when shouted at. And when that friction increases, pressure builds. The system strains. And eventually, it produces a second, far more dangerous crisis point. The second crisis is not legal, it is political. And it is unfolding in real time. Once documents are public, they stop being evidence alone. They become weapons in an electoral environment. Opponents don't need to exaggerate. They only need to display the record and ask a question repeatedly, calmly, relentlessly. This is where timing becomes lethal. Trump is not confronting these revelations in retirement or historical hindsight. He is facing them in the middle of an election cycle, already burdened by multiple legal battles and relentless scrutiny. Every interview now carries a trap. Every rally risks a headline. Every denial invites a comparison with what's written in black ink. Political campaigns thrive on offense, on controlling the narrative. But this forces Trump into defense. And defense is where contradictions multiply. The crisis deepens because there is no clean counterstory. You cannot simultaneously claim the documents are fake and argue the interactions were innocent. Those positions cancel each other out. Voters sense that incoherence, even if they can't articulate it. And when political contradictions become personal, the consequences are felt most sharply by the people listening. Not analysts, not lawyers, but you. Now let me speak directly to you. Because this is where systems stop being abstract and start affecting judgment. When you hear a leader say, "Trust me, you are making a quiet calculation. You are weighing consistency. You are weighing honesty. You are deciding whether the person asking for power respects you enough to tell the truth even when it's uncomfortable." What these documents do is force that calculation into the open. They ask you to reconcile years of denials with written records that tell a different story. And that moment when belief collides with evidence is deeply unsettling. You don't need to be a lawyer to understand why this matters. If someone repeatedly minimizes a relationship and the record shows it was extensive, you naturally ask, why lie? What else was shaped for convenience? This is not about partisan loyalty. It's about standards, about whether credibility still has weight, about whether accountability still exists for people who operate at the highest levels of power. If you believe leadership requires honesty, now is the moment to pay attention. Because what happens next depends on whether voters like you decide that truth still matters. And the consequences of that decision won't stop at national borders. They ripple outward, far beyond American politics. What unfolds in the United States never stays contained in the United States. America's political standards are watched, studied, and often copied around the world. When a country that claims to lead on rule of law, transparency, and democratic accountability appears willing to shrug at documented contradictions from its most powerful figures, it sends a signal, not just to allies, but to authoritarians, oligarchs, and strongmen everywhere. They learn a lesson that loyalty can outweigh evidence, that repetition can overpower records, that institutions may exist, but enforcement depends on political will. This is how democratic erosion travels, not through coups, but through normalization. The Epstein case already symbolized a global failure of elite accountability. Powerful men crossing borders, money insulating behavior, systems hesitating to act. When documents linking prominent political figures to that ecosystem are met with indifference, the message is clear: power still protects itself. That damages trust far beyond elections. It weakens cooperation, it fuels cynicism, it tells younger generations that transparency is optional and consequences are negotiable. So the question becomes unavoidable, not just what happens next, but what kind of future this pattern creates. And there are only three realistic paths forward. From here, the system branches. And there are only three plausible futures. The first is accountability. Not perfection, accountability. Voters weigh evidence seriously. Institutions hold. Transparency changes behavior, even if slowly. In this path, leaders learn that denial has limits, that records matter, and that credibility is not optional. Democracy doesn't become cleaner overnight, but it becomes more honest. The second path is stagnation. The documents circulate, the outrage spikes, then fatigue sets in. Partisans retreat to their corners. Elections are decided on identity rather than evidence. Nothing fully collapses, but nothing is corrected either. Trust continues to erode quietly, like infrastructure no one maintains until it fails. The third path is normalization of impunity. Evidence no longer shocks, contradictions no longer matter, loyalty becomes the only currency. In that future, power learns the ultimate lesson. Transparency is survivable. And once that lesson sets in, the damage is irreversible. Which path emerges depends on incentives, on whether voters reward honesty or excuse deception, on whether institutions are defended or dismissed. Systems do not choose for us, they respond to pressure. And that brings us to the final question, what this moment ultimately demands from all of us. So this is where we end, but not where the story ends. What these documents reveal is not just a contradiction in one man's narrative. They expose a stress test for an entire system. Courts did their job. Records surfaced. Transparency, at least this time, worked. The remaining question is whether society responds or shrugs. History is shaped less by scandals than by reactions to them. Evidence doesn't enforce itself. Accountability doesn't activate automatically. It requires attention, memory, and a refusal to normalize what should never be normal. If a political system learns that documented lies carry no cost, it adapts, it stops fearing exposure, and once that happens, truth becomes irrelevant, not because it disappears, but because it no longer matters. That is the real danger here. This moment asks something simple and difficult at the same time. Will voters reward honesty, even when it's uncomfortable? Will institutions be defended when they force transparency? Or will power once again outlast truth? If you care about where this leads, don't look away. Share this. Talk about it. Stay engaged. Because the future of accountability is not decided in sealed courtrooms. It's decided by what we choose to accept next. End bridge. And what comes next may define far more than a single election.